All right. So as long as there's no incriminating evidence um, on display, I'd like to begin this podcast where we tier rank many of the famous philosophers of yore and also in yesteryear, and also the unsightly present that unfortunately we must persevere through in order to have any sort of semblance of a humane existence. Um, Sadly. Anyway, we have Althusser Aquinas. You've got a lot of people. It's not comprehensive, but it's a good mix of high grade philosophers that contrasted with some of the more contemporary favorites in modern academia. Um, Without any further ado, I will start. Let's get some of the easy ones out of the way. Let's do Aquinas and Confucius and Copernicus. These ones are almost like disqualified. And let's do Aristotle too. Um, I think these guys are a little disqualified because they're really masters of their own domain. Aquinas is a scholastic theologian, sort of par none. Um, Bar none. I mean, he really is. He's the exemplar of that sort of narrow discipline. I don't think you can really compare him easily to anyone else unless you're talking medieval uh, sentential logic and medieval theological logic, um, as it were, to put it crudely. Um, I think Aquinas is this is again they do this thing on these tier lists where they try to give them a punk evaluation, like how punk are they. And I guess the lowest ranking, I didn't make this list to clarify, but the lowest ranking is Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand tier, which I think is pretty comical. And then basic god tier Chad is high, is the ultimum, is the optimum. And then very punk is, yeah, punk, meh, normie, polizia in Spanish. It's all pretty funny. So I'll do Aquinas. Uh, this list is a little. I guess in terms of his, it's like intensively politicized and thus sort of polarized artificially and in a secondary light. I want to rank the quality of the philosopher, not the sexiness. But this, so I think we can kind of disregard these somewhat. Although I'll try to keep it in the available constraints. I guess ranking Aquinas, I would put him at meh because his insights are not super amazing. Not He writes in a very, even for its time, it was a very self-evident observatory manner. His observatory, whatever. His speculation ability to speculate did not seem very special or unique or piquant or what have you. It felt like he was really good at sort of stating the obvious, and for me that's not punk, but it's also not really normie either. I think he's sort of meh, and I think he's decidedly meh. And I think as a monk, he in a highborn monk as well, he's sort of, he's very even handed, but it's and comprehensive and prolific, but not special, not unique. By the way, for the purpose of this podcast, I will differentiate between special and unique because I'll probably be using those words a lot. Unique is almost like calling someone an enigma, but in a milder sense. There's someone that really just there's no one quite like them. Special means that they're what they wrote was just really pivotal or um, exemplary of exemplifies philosophy or is exemplary in a particular philosophical category. So Copernicus is up next. Copernicus is not really a philosopher, so far as I know. I would say he's kind of punk because he did try to reevaluate the whole way we look at cosmology. So you got to give a little credit where credit is blatantly due. Blatantly, Copernicus is somewhat of an edge lord. Um, he was also very, if you know anything about his biography, he was a very neurotic, sort of cagey, insular personality. He wasn't really the most. I mean, I think if you just sort of, I think a lot of people were kind of afraid to like probe him with questions, but I don't necessarily think he wasn't a great lecturer, but I don't necessarily think he was a bad guy. I just think that he was difficult for certain people to interact with. But I don't think he if you kind of knew if you kind of just stood your ground, he probably would talk to you. Like he was like autistic, you know. He wasn't like mean. He was just sort of awkward. Um, so he's punk. Confucius. Confucius is like the Asian. I mean, he's not supposed to be on this list to be frank with you, but he is on this list because I didn't make the list, even though I respect it somewhat. I did not make it, and so I cannot claim full authority. However, Confucius is kind of a good counterweight to everyone else. He's a lot like Aquinas, although, or Aristotle or Plato, but I think he's more like, in a way, he's more like a modern influencer than he is like an actual philosopher. He is a very cult of personality sort of orbit that he was known for, and he wasn't really like taking over the government in his own time. But in subsequent generations, Mencius would pick up on his work and and sort of convert the dignitaries and nobles into like believing uh, adamantly in Confucian doctrine, or what became sort of codified as Confucian doctrine by people like Mencius. Mencius sort of was like, you know, led the spear charge for, he spearheaded the whole thing. Confucius, in terms of him being cool or uncool, I would say he's a little cooler than Aquinas. I think and the reason is although he's a conservative and who promotes family values and moderation in all things and sort of the endless pursuit of sort of dull wisdom. You know, he's kind of a dullard. He's kind of unexciting, but that's why he's so, you know, coy and wise and kind of, he's an old man. Really, he's just like this pinnacle of elderly sage wisdom. So Confucius is a lord. He's got all these demerits to make him seem sort of like a pig. But the reality is that Confucius wanted people to not be so, um, let's say, bureaucratic. And he also didn't want people to be so warlike and agitating. So he really, you see this in the doctrine of the mean. He really looked for like a sort of a way to circumvent these two extremes and be sort of even-handed. And he didn't do it in like this weird cosmological way that Aquinas does. He did it in a very like matter-of-fact, plain-spoken way. Unless, you know, as long as currently available writings are reflective of how he actually spoke. I think Confucius was, in his own way, sort of cutting edge. Now he isn't seen that way, but even now you read his writings and he's very like insightful and deep. And anyone who's deep in like a private sort of way is not someone who I think is like, you know, the police or a normie. So I think he's slightly punk, even if it's an unintuitive choice. Uh, Up next, this is like the third time I've done one of these. I don't know why I care so much. I'm just always trying to refine my critique on pure reason. Let's say no, my always trying to refine my ability to critique these figureheads. Um, and did we Aristotle? Okay, great. We didn't do him. He's not police. He's not really a normie. I mean, his ethics are pretty square. He's kind of what we see as definition square. He's not that different from Aquinas. The only reason I think Aristotle is more punk than Aquinas is that he's writing in a pre-Christian pagan era, and he's using sort of abstract thought to develop a rationalizing system that can logically determine or deduce, as it were, logically deduce uh, factoids about the properties of the universe. So he's really trying to systemize, but he's trying to systemize perceptual information metaphysically, and he kind of lays the groundwork for epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, um, insofar that we can distinguish between ethics and politics. And he also, for aesthetics, he called it kind of poetics, but all these sorts of disciplines, he laid the groundwork. I think if without Aristotle, with or without Aristotle, you would still be seen as at minimum a blank slate because he doesn't really provide a lot to the modern education that isn't assumed into curricular genera, like, or what's the word, like generic curricular stuff. I like you go to any public education system will teach you ideas that are implied by Aristotle's writings. Simple as that. So you're learning Aristotle, whether you know it or not. You're learning what he wrote. He's that sort of constitutive to like the education system in the Western world, and pretty much even like other places too. Anywhere that's been influenced by Aristotle has sort of incorporated his ideas into all scientific and academic disciplines, humanities as well. So Aristotle is kind of like the beginning of schools, as far as we can really in a non-language sense, like I mean, even that grammar, right? It was, you see inklings of grammar with Aristotle. So everything sort of stems from Aristotle a little bit, at least a little bit. Um, I think in his own time, he was obviously an advisor to Alexander the Great. Famously, he was his personal tutor and advisor for a time. This doesn't sound very punk. I would say he's kind of a normie. That's where I'd put him. I think he's less punk than Aquinas, if only because Aquinas at least had to like argue his points. I think Aristotle sort of had everything kind of. I think the domain by which Aristotle performed was a domain that was less inherently controversial than Aquinas, and he lived in a time where philosophical banding about was um, decidedly not controversial. Whereas Aquinas, he had to sort of work within a system that was rigid and slow going. And even though he was profited off that system, just by being in that system, there's a trace element of sort of like, like having to force your way ahead. Whereas I think with Aristotle, all he had to really do was eat up what Plato and others were doing and sort of develop his own artistic sort of, um, proto scientific version. And he did that. But I think he kind of established what it means to be normal in a philosophical circumstance, and it may be even a little bit lower, maybe even somewhere near police, in the sense that we're sort of burdened by Aristotle now. But I don't think we're so burdened by it. I think there is sort of an obligation inherent into any philosophical rumination to sort of treat it with an Aristotelian dialectic or discourse. But I don't think that is like so burdensome as to be sort of law abiding. I do think it's just sort of a taken for granted structure, and that's why I call it normal. He's not demanding anything. We just sort of assume his values, um, whether we intend to or not. Okay, up next. Uh, Some of these I'm gonna. Okay, I don't know everything about Fanon, but I'll get him out of the way. I think Fanon is a very interesting. I think he wrote in French. Very interesting pioneer of post-colonial philosophy, justice writings, ethics. Um, I think you have to call him punk in a way. I don't think that he himself hated government, but I do think that he was hated the government as such in his time. So I would say he is punk. Um, he does seem like come off a little bit as a square, and I think he really valued um, restructuring of hierarchy rather than individual rebellion. So I would put him at punk, but not very punk. We'll try to find an example next of someone who's very. Oh, here we are. This guy is sort of the go-to for very punk. Um, I think he is Diogenes of wherever it was. He didn't care what anyone thought about him, and he was sort of annoying because of that. And people respected him a lot because he didn't care. But it was a gift and a curse. Um, there's so many anecdotes about Diogenes. Like he would always eat lentils, so that he never had to you know, um, deal. He never had to go to suck up to anyone and have them host him. He never wanted to be hosted by anyone who was famous or who was rich because he didn't want to have to suck up to them in order to eat their fine foods and drink their fine wines, the cheeses, right? The fruits, right? All that. He didn't want any of that. So he just ate lentils and he was sort of seen as like a low life. But it was a determined version of being a low life. And Aristotle, he kind of, I've heard that he sort of had a girlfriend that was the daughter of a noble family, and he didn't want to bother. Sorry, he didn't. She just ran away from the family and shacked up with him in his little hut, and they just sort of had a quiet life. But it was like a huge, uh, um, caused a lot of uproar in the aristocracy of the town. And then the other story, and so he was kind of like an edge lord, right? And the other story is, and this is also edge lord, is that Alexander the Great shows up to visit the town and possibly of Sinope or whatever it is, Sinope, and possibly even bother Diogenes on purpose. And Diogenes doesn't even recognize him as this great conqueror. He just tells him to step out of the sunlight because he was working on his tan or something. Like he wanted to enjoy the sunlight, so he told him to step out. And then Alexander kind of walks off or turns around or speaks to someone who's an assistant, I suppose, and says, if I weren't Alexander the Great, I would be Diogenes because I respect his balls. And so Diogenes kind of had a reputation more than the other, um, Hellenistic philosophers. He's a cynic. He founded that he kind of is the exemplar of cynicism as a discipline insofar that you can really call it a concrete discipline in philosophy. I think Diogenes is very punk. I don't think he's base god tier Chad because he's a little he's a little insipid. He doesn't really have a formulated um, point of view, but he does reflect sort of the epitome of what makes a philosopher good. So he gets high praise. But it's sort of like a tactical praise. His actual strategy as a philosopher to me was not extremely um, uh, available in any lesson you get on him. On next, someone who did have a really good strategy and maybe not a great tactic was Kierkegaard. I think Kierkegaard was someone, unlike Diogenes, Kierkegaard had almost no real personality. He had almost no real edge, but his strategy was completely revolved around the belief that was fundamental to a rightful human existence. So more than a bit of a hypocrite. He was essentially like an incel. He refused to date. He refused marriage at one point because his betrothed didn't satisfy some strange religious criterion that he had devised because he was so avid about his personal spirituality. He was a Christian, but he was had a really extreme variation on Christianity that most people in Denmark did not understand. Um, but he's an exceptionally passionate individual, and he was probably one of the first, or maybe he was more, maybe one of the kind of a midpoint in the existentialist canon that people tend to read. I think after Nietzsche is Kierkegaard. When was Kierkegaard? Soren Kierkegaard. It must have been late 1800s, right? Mid. Okay, so he was the first. Sort of. He's an interesting guy because um, he's unusual. Okay. So he was before Nietzsche, which I didn't piece together, but it makes sense given the technology he was using in the stories about him. And he lived during the time of Mozart, or not the time of Beethoven. I mean, and he would. There's a story where Kierkegaard goes to the opera and hears Don Giovanni and by Mozart. Mozart's dead, but he still it's the first time he hears it, I think. And or maybe Mozart wasn't dead, but it was close enough. I think he was dead. Anyway, he leaves his seat, walks out into the lobby or whatever it is, the mezzanine, right? And he puts his back to the wall, and he's like, "At last, I can hear music that makes me tremble. Like at last, he can be shaken by music." And his whole thing was that like there was nothing that really pushed beyond the grain enough for him in music. And also he kind of has this attitude about life in general. It's that like there's no one's really taking leaps of faith anymore. And that was an important part of experience and but also not just experience, being a dutiful Christian. So his whole attitude, and this is kind of birthed existentialism as a doctrine, as something that was sort of positive. Not nihilism, but like a positive version of nihilism known as existentialism. Existentialism. And so Kierkegaard really didn't like how staid society had become, and I can see how growing up in Scandinavia, you would think that because think if anything stayed, it's Scandinavian society, right, and culture. But he didn't like that. He was self aware enough to dislike it somehow, and he's a really interesting character because apparently when he died, he never married. He died kind of young. He wrote books. He was always writing about the Bible. He had a mental breakdown kind of when he was 30, a mild one, but he realized he didn't write. He had never written anything substantial, and he didn't hadn't taken a leap of faith. And so he did take this leap of faith and became this famous author by force of will, even though he was writing sort of reflexively about his own inadequacy. Um, I mean, this is so he's a very romantic era kind of guy. I don't know if he wrote fiction or not, but I think he must have. But I don't think he's known for it. He also wrote in pseudonyms for some reason. I think he was kind of embarrassed by his passion, and so he wrote. He didn't write in his own name, but when he died, his I think at the funeral, his uncle and his brother got in a huge argument about and got in a fist fight because they didn't one of them understood Kierkegaard's sympathies or sentiments to Christianity and funerals and stuff, and the other one didn't understand his ethics about that. And so they got in a huge fight about the legacy of Kierkegaard because even then they knew that he was this incredible writer. Um, and it's unusual. You don't see a lot of people from Denmark having this quality. So he's a unequivocally Danish author. I think he's very punk. I don't know that his personal lifestyle was punk. Probably not. I don't think his. I mean, he died 1855 though, so yeah, the world was a lot different back then. A lot more traditional, no matter how you slice it. But he just seems a little bit boring. But that's a lot of people. But back then, even back then, like he wasn't as crazy as Marquis de Sade, you know, not by he was the kind of the opposite, and yet he sort of had this attitude, like he was like a bougie version of I don't they Sade, like he sort of had this punk attitude, but he didn't really walk the walk. He just talked the talk. So while he promoted punk, I can't put him at very punk. I have to put him at just punk because he seemed a little bit like the Talking Heads. Like he seemed like a new wave, watered down version of punk rather than the real deal. Despite being kind of the godfather of existentialism, which seems as about punk as it would get, but he was just kind of a little too square or something at the end of the day. I think the girl he liked was named Christina, but I can't remember. Or Beatrice. No, that's Dante. I think it was Christina. Anyway, how are we for time? 25. This is the problem with these philosophy ones is it's so easy to get bogged down. Okay, another one, Descartes. Descartes was punk. He developed used mathematical no. He developed and invented mathematical notation and sort of used his experience from that to sort of create rationalism, and he did by putting himself in a boring oven where he had no sensory information, and he was kind of nuts. And he didn't do it. He wasn't an eccentric all the time, but he was enough of an eccentric that he died kind of young in his 50s, I believe. And he just kind of froze it. He got like pneumonia from walking to work, and because he worked for the Queen of England, I think. Sorry, the Queen of Sweden. He also kind of died in Denmark. But the reason he wouldn't be very punk was because he was known. He didn't agree with Galileo when that was published, and his when Galileo's observations from the telescope were published, he sort of dismissed it out of fear that he'd get persecuted. He wrote a lot of letters, sort of brown nosing different intellectuals in this theater in the academic theater at the time. He was really kind of not like a super out there guy on a minute by minute basis. But I think because he just sort of single handedly invented rationalism in an eccentric way, he has to be considered at least more punk than Thomas Aquinas. Even though Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle kind of, they developed the logic, but they didn't develop rationalism as a ideology or as a philosophical approach. Not in the same politically charged way, at least. Uh, they definitely were leaning towards that. Let's not without mincing too many words, they definitely were leaning in that way, but they hadn't really claimed it yet. They hadn't really known that they needed to claim it. Maybe they would have if it was explained to them, but they weren't those types. They weren't, as far as like the conversation of empiricism versus rationalism goes. I think they would have believed in rationalism somewhat, but I just don't think that they would have known that they had to sort of drive a stake in that soil. And even Descartes wasn't really like he was the first rationalist, but even he wasn't like stridently a rationalist. He just laid the groundwork for it, and everyone's sort of had to give him due acknowledgments ever since. Bentham is a police guy. I mean, I like him. He's eccentric. The weird part is that while Bentham is like very much an eccentric like Diogenes or even Kierkegaard or Descartes, he is not, or Copernicus in a way. I mean, all of them are kind of eccentric, but those are kind of the most eccentric. Aquinas might be somewhat eccentric too, but Bentham was very eccentric, and he was almost doing it for attention. And he founded a university, so he was a well-known intellectual, prominent intellectual in his own time in the early 1700s or whatever it was, late 1700s. And he invented kind of a utilitarian doctrine. Like Kierkegaard, he also and Descartes, he invented a school. But his school of utilitarianism would be heavily modified by people like John Stuart Mill. But still, he invented this school, and in his kind of conception of it, it was a lot more about controlling society so that to unshackle it from the due diligence of like actually running a society. He was kind of evil a little. I don't think he definitely didn't think he was evil, but he kind of had like a sort of glib detachment when it came to like governance or whatever. So he was a man of the late Enlightenment, but he was also kind of a corruption of that spirit. And then utilitarianism, of course, had to be modified. He was known for inventing a lot of things in sort of a quixotic manner, things that don't tend to really come up. He a little bit like Benjamin Franklin, I would guess. He was sort of the British Benjamin Franklin. He invented things that didn't really ever come in everyday conversation, but they just happened to be invented by Jeremy Bentham. And one of those things, which points to how much of a totalitarian he was that he tried to invent a way to replace prisons by having a panopticon, which is a surveillance system comprised of mirrors that will allow you to see every room from like a seat from like a one seat in one room by just having mirrors that like would sort of reflect all the other mirrors and allow an entire building like a mansion, let's say, to I don't know if it was actually would work for a mansion, but it would work for certain buildings where you could see every room just by the positioning of many different mirrors. So that's a surveillance state, and he was promoting that in the 1700s. Um, I guess he was kind of part of the utopian movement. It kind of took momentum later on, but he was a predecessor to it, but also sort of he wouldn't have fit in with that either. He was kind of in a league of his own. And it's interesting. You almost get the impression that Jeremy Bentham, despite founding utilitarianism, doesn't really have a strong connection to it. The same thing you could say about Descartes and Kierkegaard. They founded schools, but did they really have like a strong connection to the sort of group politics and group psychology of those schools? I wouldn't say so. I would say that they kind of stand alone, and it's very interesting, and that's why they're such figureheads. Is because they don't really reflect the groupthink that has come to define those schools of thought, but they sort of have always been kind of mentally on their own island. He's a police. I hate to say it. He's the lowest ranked one on this list um, in terms of his value as a philosopher. I think he doesn't really appreciate liberty um, in any standout kind of way. He doesn't seem like a bad person to have tea with, but he just doesn't seem like he seems funny. But he's like it's like if some crazy comedian wanted to be a philosopher rather than a comedian, and they became sort of like a douche tool that tried to like micromanage society to the point that people would find like a new vein of oppression all of a sudden before them, or that they're living in. He seemed like that kind of guy, and that's not really healthy for devising for the project of philosophy. It's noteworthy and memorable, but it's not really the ideal, I would think. Okay, up next is Jean Baudrillard, personal favorite of mine. My colleague Will Daly does not really like Jean Baudrillard, probably because he doesn't like just has a sort of a glib pessimism towards critical theory. Glib. Well, I mean, who doesn't? A lot of people are like that. Can't blame them. I actually really like critical theory, not because I think they're the smartest people in the room, or any. I just think that they're often the most constructive and agile people in the room. They really seem to be trying to create actively promote philosophy and create philosophical systems, or some sort of ribosomic creation. They're trying to do philosophy, let's say, when other people are kind of tired of it, and I think that's why I like French. It's also written in French, which is kind of fun. So Jean Baudrillard, I think he's very punk. I think he really cares about liberty. He cares about human connectedness. He cares about connectedness to the earth, kind of like Heidegger. I mean, they all come from Heidegger, don't they? Anyway, these critical theorists. But he cares about sort of the immediacy of primal experience and how that's been violated by technology, by artificial mindsets. hypnosis machine that is the mass media. So yeah, the 24-hour news cycle. He was famous for his simulacrum and simulation or whatever. He has his ideas that like everything we're doing now is a fake sort of version of things that we did in the past, not even like in the recent past, in many cases, but also just broadly in the past. Um, like we use plastic instead of wood. That's and then Guy Debord is another guy who's like him. I'm going to put him up. I know he's on this list. Guy Debord, I think, wrote The Society of the Spectacle. Yeah. And Herbert, and while we're at Herbert Marcuse, or if he's on here, he has to be, right? It's Marcuse. Maybe not. Maybe Leotard will go up there in his place. Weird. Okay, so Guy Debord's also, I think, is very punk. I'll have to. As far as I know, Guy Debord says things similar to. He's a more accessible version of Baudrillard because he says that we're so committed to spectacle that we don't care about anything else. And yes, exactly, right here, commodity fetishism, religion, and marketing, and so he's saying all these things that basically have pervaded my own thinking, off the records, off the books. But he sort of just says it. He just out and out says it. So, and he and Baudrillard kind of are in a similar um, camp, as far as I can tell. I don't know what they thought of each other, or if they had any sort of mutual respect. They must have. They must have, though. It seems undeniable. They seem almost like they could have been the same dude. I think they're a little bit weakened because they seem to write the same sort of thing, but using different language. Maybe Baudrillard's a bit more roundabout in his description, in his analysis, but Guy Debord is a little maybe too straightforward. Anyway, they're very punk. They obviously are anti-establishment for sure. Not only anti-establishment, they also anti-consumerism, which is I think is extremely punk. Anti-materialism to some extent too. Um, okay, Jacques Derrida. I cannot understand what his real policy is. Um, I probably should have given him more of a deep dive rather than just sort of take other people's word for it. But I do think he was named for the Nobel Prize in Literature, dude. I don't know what is going on with this guy. Yeah, this guy is kind of like he kind of plays around with philosophy more than he really embraces it. I think he's kind of a dilettante or maybe even a charlatan. I don't know. Um, he's really into the whole play of opposites line of thinking. He's very like Hegelian, of course. He seems like he sort of has his own weird phenomenological twist on the dialectic, sort of the ficta, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, or whatever it is, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But does that make him a good philosopher? No. I think he's sort of an example of where philosophy goes wrong. Um, I don't think I think he's good at being a bad philosopher, maybe a little bit like Bentham. The reason I don't think he's good is I don't understand what he does. He wrote. He's not bad in moral sense. He's just bad in like a redundant sense. I don't know what he writes about that someone else wasn't already hitting on. Maybe I don't appreciate the pull that Derrida has with certain types of mentalities, maybe certain psychological demographics, you know, prefer Derrida for reasons I don't really have words for, or maybe even have a good sense on. Um, Structuralism, yeah, I'm sure. Maybe maybe for me, it's just kind of obvious the things he's saying. Is he Algerian? I think he is Algerian. I don't really know that Algerians are going to make good philosophers. We have Albert Camus, who's the only other Algerian that's sometimes grouped in with these guys, and he never had really a comprehensive philosophy. It seems like they sort of are adjacent to French philosophy, but then they sort of bow out of it in their execution. And so maybe he understands the philosophy, but he just can't write it. And like Camus, he can imply it, but he can't write it. So I don't know. I would call him a normie because I just don't understand what he's contributing that packs any sort of punch. Uh, Even though he's eccentric, but he's not. He doesn't seem to have a strong enough personality to be considered punk in any slight kind of definition. He's just eccentric, but he's a square eccentric, probably because he's so unoriginal seeming. And apparently, he had a mixed relationship with Jacques Lacan, which doesn't surprise me at all, but is very humorous. Okay, this guy. Let's do this. I'm getting tired. I mean, this is the third one I've done. Memorial Day. This is Memorial Day, and not these guys are dead, dead soldiers, sort of, kind of. All right, let's just run through these. A lot of these guys are going to be more of the same. Lacan is also kind of a normie for me. He sort of has some high flown pseudo ideas about the psyche that are rather directionless in their intention or their delivery. Both. We got another one. We got Freud. Okay, Freud is a lot more punk. I don't want to throw psychoanalysis under the bus, but it is a little bit like emotional chess sometimes, just sort of a game people play. I would say this guy is base god tier Chad because he tells you that you're trying to fuck your mom or your dad, and he just doesn't really apologize about it, and then you're sort of going through life thinking that and trying to make sense of it. And whether or not there's kernels of truth, you still kind of get shattered by it. You get fucked by it. So I think Freud is pretty intense. And I also think he went against the system of the time. He carved his own path, his own name for himself. He might be one of the most famous people on this list. The Buddha is obviously more famous. Marx is probably a little more famous. But Plato, but he's probably about as famous as Plato. Or Kant, maybe somewhere in between Plato and Kant. I don't know, maybe more. Yeah, so Freud is about as good as it gets. I think if you can develop a system like Freud, you've really done the punk rock philosophy um, homework. I don't know. I don't know how to describe this. You really are the rock god of philosophers if you can do what Freud did. Now, I don't think that Freud himself is that appealing of a personality. He's definitely someone it'd be fun to have tea with, but he's sort of like the opposite of Bentham. He maybe some people would say he's like Bentham. He does a disservice. So I can see the counter perspective, but on this list you got to have someone at base god tier Chad. I think it's him. I also think Foucault is kind of there too. Foucault is just so weird and sexualized, and to me, that's very honest and daring. What's more punk than that? Do I necessarily agree with his style? No, but I don't think he was an inaccurate describer of phenomena. I think maybe his scholarship could have been a little more rigorous, right? Apparently, he does a lot of facts. Like he just makes up things and assumes as historical fact just because it suits his narrative. But like that's also like that doesn't mean his narrative is totally wrong. It just means that he's adding a little too much fuel to it than it deserves. Like he came up with this notion that the ship of fools was a real thing, which was just like it was like a medieval sort of story, an allegory. But he just assumed it was like a documented fact that they had these they would send insane people on a ship to nowhere into like the ocean or whatever, so that just to ship them away. That's like a sort of a mythology. One thing that does happen in the Middle Ages is that you can't just lounge about and not have a job. Apparently, if you were caught not working, someone would show up with like a bow and arrow, a guard, right? And they would like put you to work. That's might be true. So it's like forced labor. But I don't think that they would ship people off into the oblivion of the deep sea just to like get rid of people like in a sort of an ethnic cleansing kind of way or a eugenics kind of way. Not ethnic, but eugenics, right? The retarded people have to go on a boat and then just drown. You know, and, I, I don't even know. So, but I think Foucault is definitely, for all his like glaring faults, he has sort of a muscularity that kind of pushes the envelope, and that's pretty impressive. Let's be real. Camus is on this list, and I do think Camus is very punk. I think the fact that he's sort of has a reputation as a philosopher without really being a philosopher is cool. He wrote a bunch of philosophical novels. Some are more readable than others, but they're all very have intense, moody, dark tones. And he died kind of young, in his I think 40s or 50s, maybe early 40s or something. He was always riding his motorcycle, very you know, kind of this whining and dining, chain smoking man about town. Don't know much about his exploits in life. I don't get the impression he traveled a hell of a lot. Doesn't seem the most adventurous guy, but his books are very thought provoking, if in this sort of heavy handed, in one dimensional existential vein. Still, I think Albert Camus is kind of cool. Um, Maybe a little bit um, drivelly. Like, do you really want to? Does it kind of droll, right? Or not? What does droll mean? Funny? No, not droll. He kind of drones on a little, kind of like I do, but he's a lot. He does it in his novels in a more impressive way than what I do. Um, anyway, up next, Rousseau. I think Rousseau really does kind of hit the base god tier Chad notes. He was sort of a carnival freak. He had sort of a circus freak veneer to him. He kind of was really into music and really sort of hazy daisy, and kind of had a big. He had like a lot of kids with his wife, but he was always poor, and he had to travel for work and stuff, and it was kind of indigent. And then when he was older, he wrote books just about the reflections of a solitary walker. Right, that was the book. He wrote a book later on about how he had to just meander around as an older man, and obviously he's very famous for his man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains, and he promoted the whole noble savage doctrine. But I think that's extremely punk, sort of promoting the common weal over elitist structures, sort of valuing individualism despite the odds. I think there's nothing more punk than that. And although I don't necessarily view him as like a G.G. Allen type of guy, I do think his values would have kind of led the groundwork for existentialism somewhat. And I think that existentialism is heavily informative to punk. And it leans it hits the right notes in terms of having a philosophy. So yeah, he's up there. Heidegger. Why am I going? Okay, I guess I can do Heidegger. Martin Heidegger is he's not he was known everyone knows that Heidegger was like a Nazi before he was like a famous philosopher, or he was kind of like concomitant with it, like he was doing his philosophy and he was a member of the Nazi party. So Heidegger was kind of like controversial, and he had to get Hannah Arendt to sort of remedy that and write sort of apologetics for Heidegger. And there was a guy called Richardson who did the same thing. I think it was William Richardson, William S. Richardson, I think. So, and then there's all these sorts of people who some of them are more famous than others. There's a guy who's on the YouTube a lot. He's an older man. I think he might be dead. Hubert Dreyfus. I forget, but he was an older man who was an apprentice to Heidegger or whatever you would call it. He was you know the Emmanuel. He was like a follower of Heidegger, and he met him at one point in the 70s before he died. Heidegger is punk. I mean, Heidegger is like his actual like philosophy is very based in like understanding human experience and the importance of sort of experiences in life. He's sort of adjacent to existentialism, somewhat sort of tangential, maybe sort of runs in parallel, but isn't super connected, perhaps. But he's definitely not like unfamiliar to existentialists, good existentialists, and, and someone like Jean Paul Sartre, was sort of like um, probably very much acquainted with Heidegger's thinking. He wrote a book that was sort of a nod to it. Heidegger wrote Being in Time, and Sartre wrote Being in Nothingness. And Sartre is probably the most famous existentialist, or at least the most iconic. Let me see on this list. Here is Jean Paul Sartre. And Jean Paul Sartre is kind of a combination. To me, he's a combination of Heidegger and Camus. He writes novels, he writes philosophy. He's probably not the best at either, but he does them both with mixed success. I mean, financially, good amount of success, but with just sort of mixed, I think, critical success compared to Heidegger or Camus. But he's can kind of wed those two worlds, and he's very punk. I think. I mean, he's more punk than Heidegger. Um, I don't know. I don't think he's kind of like with he and Camus are kind of like Guy Debord and Baudrillard. Camus and Debord are like sort of the one of them is a little more lowbrow, the middle brow, and the one's a little more high, not lowbrow, but one of them is middle brow, one of them is kind of highbrow in their accessibility, and so they're kind of you kind of have to have both in order to have a fully formed message. So that's a strong connection, I think. Okay, up next, obviously Sartre's philosophy is sort of decrepit in some ways, but I think that it it, it aims towards a sort of a wholesomeness. Um, it's just not. He just doesn't really have the gas in the tank for it. But I think you can derive a fair amount from Sartre's work, his style and work ethic and all that. Work and ethic, whatever it is. Okay, up next, let's see this guy, Jean-Luc Nancy. This guy was a follower of Heidegger. He is pretty much a commentator on Heidegger. Uh, I don't even really think he's a feminist. He's I don't know, kind of meh. I don't think. Yeah, he wasn't. He was sort of a codifier of pre-existing doctrines. Um, he's a good scholar. He's cool, but I don't think he's like I don't think he was the kind. He died very recently. I didn't know that. Maybe that's why he's on this list because he was been sort of re reappraised. Um, yeah, he's kind of a man about town. Okay, this guy. Yeah, like very. None of these guys are really alive anymore, are they? 98. Yeah, so he's not as cool as Leotard or Debord or Baudrillard, but he's kind of in their he's kind of a support philosopher for those guys, and he's definitely aware of good philosophy. Whether or not he's really writing it in the forefront of any movement is dubious, but he's still know I mean is a sort of ominous and subject to controversy, but I think he is without being I think he's indubitably a good square philosopher. but just not very interesting in his own right. Um, who's up next? We got a lot. Okay, we'll do Nietzsche, spice, just to add some kick of spice. Nietzsche is really great. He's a little bit of a proto-Nazi, but he avowedly was not one, and there was none when he was alive. He died kind of young. I think he died like 50s or late 40s, something like that. And he kind of went mentally ill because of they believe it was syphilis. His sister took all his manuscripts and kind of redacted his actual elaborations, and she sort of edited it down to being something that was compatible with Nazism. And Hitler sort of famously had a meeting with Nietzsche's sister where he sort of like praised her brother, and she was a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer at least, and she kind of told all those guys that Nietzsche agreed with them, but we can't really say he did because there is no like true connection in his writings to any sort of pervasive sort of ideology of white supremacy. But he did believe in he was kind of this like last gasp sort of leap of faith elitist. He just didn't have a really like a vein for it um, in his expressivity. So he sort of laid the groundwork, I think, for elitism in the 20th century, um, which is kind of awesome. I think punks are sort of elitists of self, and sometimes. So critical theory owes him a lot in a way because he's a rebel. He's a renegade, and in order to be a critical theorist, is sort of be a renegade amongst renegades. Um, this guy really defied convention. Even like Kierkegaard wished he could be Nietzsche, but he always pussyfooted around it. Nietzsche really did it, but Nietzsche also kind of went crazy and embarrassed himself a lot. So it's all just sort of a matter of perspective. But I still think that he's godlike as a philosopher because of that. And you read Nietzsche, it's so misogynistic, it's like laughable. But at the same time, he's kind of like being as honest as he can be, and you end up respecting that. Because a lot of these other guys would probably would have wanted to say certain things Nietzsche said, and they just never got around to it. Whether it would have been productive for them to do that is unlikely. But the fact of the matter is that he would just no holds bar, just sort of have a slog fest on paper and just write whatever. It's a little immature or very immature, but it was effective in sort of steamrolling the literary traditions as such, or as they were, and it sort of built momentum, built steam for a kind of a post-romantic sort of iridescent, maniacal, sort of modernist writing school of thought. Like George Bataille is another one of these. George Bataille, it was kind of like he really did not like conformity, and he thought that you just had to rebel. He was a little bit of a fusion of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And I like him a lot. I think he's very punk. Because he sort of wanted you to. He really thought that you had to sort of push your way into new experiences, push your way into freshness, and that's what having a good life was about. Life wasn't about rigorously sort of composing a diet of experiences. Life was about forcing yourself into the great wide open. And Bataille, obviously, Kierkegaard believed in that fundamentally, and Nietzsche sort of kind of lived it a little, but and then also kind of believed in it. But he didn't. He believed in it in a way that didn't conform with how he actually performed. It was just he believed in it on many different levels, including levels higher than himself, as with the Ubermensch and all that. And I think Bataille was kind of a liaison in his corpus between the two. I think he also died kind of in like his 50s. These guys don't tend to live very long, right? I think they're just they don't understand health that well. I think that's sort of that's why they're so punk is because what punk cares about health, what true punk does, uh, again and again and again. Lao Tzu. Okay, Lao Tzu is more punk than Confucius. Let's just go with that. Lao Tzu was a little bit of a dotty old man that wrote